Hi, HR Nation. It's Chris Rainey. Welcome to HR Leaders, the show where we interview today's most successful and innovative HR practitioners 5 days a week. Today, we have a special guest. We're joined by Lolly Daskal. Lolly is a leadership coach, consultant, speaker, and the best-selling author of the book, The Leadership Gap. Lolly, welcome to the show. How are you?
Chris, it's so great to be here.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for coming back to me. I'm sure you get loads of weird and wonderful messages on LinkedIn and from other people. So I appreciate you replying back. Lolly, for people that aren't aware of your work, give us an overview of your background and your journey to where we are today.
So since I've been in my business for the past 3 decades, I'm going to try to keep it short. So I started out as just a teacher of self-awareness and meditation over 3 decades ago. And an individual in one of my classes said, I want you to be my coach. And for the first second, I said, you know that imposter syndrome, Chris, that pops up? I said, no, I don't know what a coach is. And I said, stop it, Lolly. You'll learn what a coach is. And I said, yes. And the minute I said yes, I went back to my alma mater, enrolled myself into more classes. I was a psychology major. And so I went back and took business classes and management classes, cognitive science classes, so I could be the best coach that I could be. And I was learning along the way with my first client. And when I knew that I was successful with my first client, what it was to be a great coach, he would recommend other clients to me. So you could say that because I allowed that imposter syndrome not to envelop me, I have a thriving coaching business for the past 3 decades. And I have to say something very important. Just because I am a coach that has been in my business for a long time, I am still a student of my profession. That means I am constantly learning what it means to be a great coach.
So I'm glad you mentioned that point because it's very important, right? Because a lot of the coaches I come across sometimes are still, talking about work that they maybe did 10 years ago, as opposed to keeping up to date with the current events. So I think it's important that you mention that to the audience.
Chris, one of the things about me is that, and a lot of coaches come to me and say, how do you have longevity in this business? It's very hard to have longevity. And so 2 things are very important. And this applies to every industry. I think that you always have to remain a student and you can't be a cookie cutter. That means you can't put people into a box. You have to open enough to say what works in this moment. Not everybody is the same. And so you constantly have to be learning about maybe bringing something new, bringing something that hasn't been tried before, maybe trying something old in a different way. And this is the most important thing. And this is about coaching, HR, CEO, boss, manager. Don't try to fix anyone, try to listen to them and ask the right questions. So that's very important in my business.
Obviously, you've been doing this for quite some time now. You've obviously got the book and the Leadership Gap. What inspired you to say, you know what, I'm gonna write this book? What was the inspiration behind that?
It's a very interesting story, and it says a lot about who I am and about what I just talked about. So around 3 years, I always wanted to write a book, but I wasn't sure what book to write. And so I wrote a proposal that I think the title was The 10 Questions That Every Leader Must Ask Themselves. It was something like that. It was a good proposal. And I shopped it around and everybody was like, wow, this is interesting. This is great. There was one publisher that said, I don't like this. They said to me, you've been in your business for so long. What do you teach to your what do you teach to your clients that really makes an impact? I said, oh, I teach my Reefing System. It's about archetypes. It teaches them who they are as a leader. They said, that interests us. Would you write a book about that? And because they said, we don't like what you have, you could do better, I was like, you're my publisher.
Yeah, love it because they're challenging you, right? Amazing. So tell us a bit more about the book then. You mentioned it briefly, the archetype.
Yes, so the book is based upon a Reefing System. It are 7 archetypes. Within ourselves, we have a polarity of character. And I'll give you an example for one of them so it makes sense. Let's say, and I brought it up a little bit earlier, let's say you want to be the kind of person that wants to make an impact in your business, in your life, in your relationships. And the way you do that is you have to have the confidence to do that. But we have this polarity of character within us that for every time we want to be confident, guess what shows up? Our self-doubt. the imposter within us. And if we don't learn to leverage that gap, guess what gets in the way? If I didn't leverage the moment and say, I'll learn how to be a great coach, then what happens is that we allow our self-doubt to rule. Now, the imposter syndrome is a very interesting syndrome because you have to ask yourself, what's the driver of that? Because as a psychologist, I want to know what makes us have this imposter syndrome. And Chris, the driver for the imposter syndrome is that we're always looking over our shoulder. The minute an individual says, what are they doing in their company? What is she doing in her department? What is he doing over there? The minute we start looking outward is the moment the imposter is inward. And so what we need to do is we need to stop asking or looking over our shoulder, and we have to ask ourselves, what can we do in order to be better to have our confidence? And there's an equation that I talk about in the book, that competence plus capability gives you your confidence. So get to know your skills, get to know your habits, get to know what you're good at, and grow on that so you have the confidence.
I absolutely love that. And it's so strange that you're talking about this now, as I was having this conversation with myself last night, because I've been offered, and I'll tell everyone that actually on the show, because I had that for a long time when I first launched the podcast. Because I had, who wants to listen to me? Is it going to work? Am I going to embarrass myself by doing this podcast? Even when I told my business partner, he said, why do you want to do a podcast? Who's going to listen to you, Chris? And then obviously the self-doubt came in. And then more recently, as the podcast has grown and it's become recognized in the HR community, I've been getting a lot of offers for speaking opportunities. And that self-doubt came straight back around. And then like, oh, are you going to bomb on stage? Do I actually know what I'm talking about as well? And I was having that conversation with myself last night, because I've had some huge opportunities come up that I actually can't even discuss on the podcast because I've actually got an NDA, but it's huge opportunities that are going to potentially transform a company. But I had that voice in my head just constantly there as a negative.
So what are you going to do now that we had this conversation?
Well, I already set a plan of motion of how to solve it, really, because for me, I come from a sporting background where, and that's also why I was transitioned quite well to being an entrepreneur, where I love the grind. I love uncomfortable, and I love being that when I find something hard and it's stressful, I run towards that. I'm a weird person in that state. Even when I first got into sales, which was my first part of the career, every time I got a no from a customer, it drove me to do it, even to get better, to learn more, to read more sales books, to develop myself. But the speaking one has always been the one that I haven't overcome. So I've basically been practicing my speech. I've been, role play with my friends, even my poor wife. It's doing role play with my wife, right? Not even joking, by the way. So I'm just trying to prepare myself for it mentally as well. So that's the only thing I can do, is continue to develop myself and develop it to get to a point where I am comfortable. When I listened to the first 10 episodes of the podcast, it makes me cringe. Of how I was, right? But whereas where I'm now, I'm a lot more comfortable in the situation. So yeah, just kind of brought that to light. What I love about it is once you're aware of it, you're really empowered. Right. I feel really empowered when I know that anything I want to achieve, as long as I'm willing to put really hard work in and determine it, and basically the willingness to just go through failures, but to keep developing yourself and learning. If you can combine both of those, then you're successful in anything you want to do.
Right. So interestingly that you bring that up. So I have this in 7 different archetypes, because most of us do a lot of thinking, and the whole book premise is to do a rethink. Rethink who you are as you are being and leading. And there's another archetype I think is very important to your audience. Can I bring that up?
Yeah, go for it.
So if you think about the Reefing System, we talked about the rebel who wants to make a difference, right? But let's talk about the Navigator. The Navigator is a very practical and a pragmatic human being. They know what they need to do. They're an expert in their field, very much like everybody that listens to your podcast. Mm-hmm. They're really, really good at what they do. And because they are that good, they are the expert in their field, people trust them. But there is a polarity of character. There is a shadow to that. Because you know so much and you are the expert, most of the individuals that are the navigator turn into the fixer. And the fixer is the human being that says, oh, you have a problem? This is what you need to do. This is how you should do it. And people don't realize the minute you become the fixer, which is the shadow, which is a leadership gap, you come across as arrogant, because most people don't want you to fix their problems. Most people want you to be silent and want you to listen or ask the questions. What do you think you need to do? So it's very important to every single individual that listens to your podcast, that is the navigator, to stop being in their leadership gap of becoming the fixer, because they come from a good place, but it doesn't have the kind of results that they want. It actually disempowers people instead of empowers people. And I talk about this more in detail in the book, but I think actually for your audience, that archetype is imperative.
Yeah, it's very important, because most of the time they already know the answer, but they don't have the confidence there, or they're doubting it, and they just want you to but it's so much more powerful when you ask. I do it to my team all the time. I say, what would you do? What do you think? And then they end up coming up with they'll solve their own problem and then walk away. They feel excited about it. They're motivated. They feel like, and it kind of leads on to better behavior as you do that. So I completely agree, but it is hard not to give them the answer, especially when you know you can immediately give them it, right? So I think it's tough, but you're right. If you become aware of that, and that was something I was taught early on by my CEO as a manager to do exactly what you said, just ask them the question back, and what would you do about it? And 90% of the time they had the response.
And sometimes they teach us. Sometimes as a coach, sometimes they teach me about what would work and what doesn't work. And so it's very important to be the best question asker and instead of the best fixer.
What was the biggest, go on, sorry?
I was going to say, by the way, that archetype really saves marriages.
Oh, I'll take that into consideration. I just got married not long ago.
Every time she says, honey, I have a problem, don't say, well, why don't you do this? Say, what happened? Can you tell
open questions.
Open. How, what, when?
Open where, why? Yeah, I'm with you. Don't worry, I'm a salesman at heart, so I live on open questions. Okay. I think I should have been a consultant in another life. So yeah, definitely. And I can say immediately right now that I don't currently do that. So my poor wife, I'm normally like, go and do that. So I can already hear myself saying it. So thanks for that advice. So I'll definitely take that in. What was the biggest surprise you had when you was writing the book? Is anything that surprised you while she was writing it that you uncovered that kind of shocked you? Or
it's one of the hardest things I've ever done, because I teach this in workshops, I teach this to organizations, I teach it to HR directors, but I wasn't accompanying the book and that everybody that was reading it. And so I felt I could give you everything about the Reefing System, but then I would overwhelm you, because it's based a lot on psychology, on Carl Jung's work, on shadow work. But I can give you the first level of it, the first layer, and you would get it. And so the hardest part for me was writing, how much should I say and how much should I keep back? Or what is too much, what is too little? That was the hardest thing for me. But it's a more complicated system than the book talks about.
So when you work with leaders, what's the first step that you take in that process? I know you work with a lot of the top leaders and the global brands. When you go into those organizations, what types of questions are you asking them? And what are the first steps you're taking with those organizations?
Absolutely. So usually I get hired by the board and says, if you don't fix him, he's out in a week. I get very upset. Yeah. Now, the thing is, when I come in, there's usually a problem, right? But if a leader doesn't want to work with me, if a boss, a CEO, an HR director, a board of directors doesn't want to work with me, I will not be successful. So the first thing I do is get to know the individual, and we have a relationship. So I don't jump in and be the coach, because it has to be a trusted relationship. We have to know if we resonate. So the first thing that I always do is see, do we resonate? Do you think you can trust me? Can I trust you? Can we have a relationship? And the thing is, then it has to be an agreement. Do you want to do the hard work that it takes to be someone who can embrace their greatness? And if the answer is yes, we'll be very successful. If the answer is no, I go find a coach that can do what you want to do. I'm not the process and procedure kind of gal anyway. I'm the one who digs up all those things you naturally don't want to talk about. So it's hard work. And so those that agree, we have agreements, they turn out to be the most amazing individuals.
Fantastic. And then what does the process look like? Do you adopt what the strategies that are within the book, that entire process, or is that first conversation really identifying the challenge, and then it normally fits within one of those particular criterias?
So I never talk about the Reefing system in the very beginning, because I first have to uncover the individual.
Yeah.
Each individual in every organization, I talk about in the book, what you don't own owns you. And I need to find out from whatever they say about themselves, what parts of themselves they're not owning, which archetype are they living in. The thing is, there are 7 archetypes, and most people say to me, which archetype am I? You have to tell me.
Yeah,
which
that's what I was thinking. How do you come to that conclusion?
So in the book, it talks about that we are all these 7 archetypes. They exist within all of us. And in every different circumstance, you have to ask yourself, which archetype do I need to be? Do I need to be the navigator now, or do I need to be the rebel now? Do I need to be the explorer or the truth teller now? Because if you don't pick the right archetype, guess what's going to show up? The gap. And the gap is where the problems start to exist. The gap is where the shadow exists, and it starts to perpetuate a real problem within the organization. And the thing is, HR directors really need to know their own gaps, because people will see it within the HR director before an HR director will see it within themselves. And that's why it's very important to do this work, and to take the assessment and to see what it is within ourselves that is showing up that everybody else sees. And there's a very important story in the book that talks about how everybody in an organization sees it, and the individual has a hard time owning their own shadows, their own gaps.
Mm-hmm. And you've seen this happen with so many organizations, I can only imagine. What are the impacts of people that don't do this? What are the impacts on the business, on themselves?
Actually, it has a monetary result. Because if you lead from your gap, you have distrust, you have chaos, you don't reach your results, you don't have a team that works together, there is no transparency, everything implodes upon itself. So the thing is, this whole idea of knowing who you are, what you're really good at, what your gaps are, and learning to leverage it, and once you know this, it makes a very vibrant organization. If everybody's speaking the same language, can you imagine how it thrives, right? But if you withhold information, or you're not aware of yourself, it tends to have stagnation. And what happens is there's a lot of mistrust in an organization, and people think, and then it turns into gossip, and then the best people, the most talented people have no patience for that, and they leave the organization. So you're left with a mediocre organization and mediocre talent.
And a bad culture.
A horrible culture. I call it a very unhealthy culture.
Yeah. So what are some practical steps that our leaders can take tomorrow, today, that they could go away and think about or do immediately?
Absolutely. So the first thing I would say is, because I know it works, is become your own coach. Read the leadership gap. Get to know the 7 archetypes, and ask yourself, how do I show up in my meetings, in my conversations? Like you just said, I hear myself, that's what I do in my relationship, right? So the next time it happens, you might laugh to yourself. You might do it, but then maybe the next time after that, you won't do it, right?
You'll become aware.
Right. You'll remember to say, ask an open-ended question. My honey just came with a problem. And so the first thing is, read the book so you have the self-awareness. Secondly is, see how you can apply it to a meeting. And in a meeting, say, who do we need? Which archetype do we need in this meeting? Instead of saying, can you tell me the truth? Or how come you're not doing that? Or how come you're not doing that? Using the language in the book is a very soft way of asking people to show up to who they need to be. Not what they need to do, and not how they need to do it, but who. And I think in leadership, who is the most important question to answer. And that's what makes this leadership book so different, because as a coach, everybody hires me and says, give me that process, give me that procedure. And I say, before I can do that, you have to answer the question of who you are. Because if I give you a process right now and I say do 1, 2, and 3, if you yourself don't have the confidence of who you are, you're not going to do my blueprint. So find out who you are, find out your strengths, find out your weaknesses. Then we can work on the what, how, the when, and even the why. So read the book and find out who you are.
Fantastic. And in all of your experience, and what do you see as the biggest sort of common challenge or mistake that people are making?
After the 99% of all the individuals, all my research shows that people suffer from the imposter syndrome. So look around your team, look around your colleagues, look around the people that you look up to. They have self-doubt sometime or another. Now, I have the privilege of coaching that 1% leader in the world that has no imposter syndrome. But guess what he has? He is so arrogant that he always says to me, teach me empathy. And so,
yeah, there's always a balance.
but 99% of us suffer from the imposter syndrome. So those you admire know that they too have it.
I noticed that more when one of the questions I ask on the podcast is, what was one of the biggest challenges you faced as a HR leader? And I would say out of the 100 podcasts I've done, over 70-80% is self-doubt, imposter syndrome. I didn't know if I could do it, Chris. I didn't know if I could lead the HR team. I didn't know. It's always, and when you're so surprised when you hear it, because I'm talking to not just the HR leaders, but, influencers in, who've got 2-3 million followers, bestsellers, people that you really look up to, and you're like, everyone has it. It's just a natural human. It's built in us. I'm sure it's a defense mechanism of some sorts. Just it's there. But
it's in our DNA. It's that shadow that exists within all of us. It's a very human thing. And if it does exist, don't spend so much time talking about the syndrome as much as saying, what can I do because I have the syndrome?
So I suppose for everyone listening, how can the HR leaders and practitioners we work with play a strategic role here to help their leaders in their organization and their business?
Absolutely. There's so many things that they can do. And the first thing is, I believe is very important, is because an HR director is so, first of all, I have so much respect for them, so much respect, and I admire them deeply. But the thing about that is that just because you know a lot, just because you are skilled, be very mindful to do more listening than you do the talking. And it's very important that to have people lead people to their own awareness. That's the best way that I could say it. Ask those questions that people say to themselves, aha. I just had an individual that I've been coaching for quite a long time. And I asked him an open-ended question about something. And he's like, give me that process. And I said, no, you're complicating things. It's very simple. Answer this one question. And he answered it. And I said, that's it. And he goes, it's that simple? So people tend to make things very complicated. But what we need to do as HR directors, as coaches, is take things that are very complicated, have people aware that we can simplify it in order to do what we need to do.
Yeah, it's so true. I completely agree with you. It is quite almost unnatural though. I think you have to train yourself. Or do you agree with that? I feel like naturally you just want to tell someone, this is how you do it. I think it really is something, a skill that you need to train in yourself.
Okay, so that's a master class that we should start taking.
Well, for me, I had to, for a long time, I was the person who gave the answer. And now I kind of, whenever I go to give the answer, that little voice in my head goes, no, Chris, remember, you need to ask a question, you need to listen. But that's taken quite a few years for me to develop that.
So whatever it takes, start today so that tomorrow it's better. I think it's the most important thing is stop being the fixer and start being the navigator. Fantastic.
When you do a lot of work with those CEOs and the HR leaders, how do you think that relationship with the CEO? We spoke earlier about, we see the HR department as the CEO, the future CEO, right? Could you elaborate a bit more on that? You spoke about it earlier, which was really fascinating.
Yeah. So I believe that, let's say, a leader has a vision, correct? And they're very inspirational. But who's the hub? Who's the heart of the organization? It's the HR director. It is the HR director that is so connected to the individuals. They know the people in the organization. Now that is, to me, when you are the heart, when you're the throbbing of what is making everything vibrate, you have a big responsibility. Yep. And the thing is, I think that even though people emulate those that are on the top, I really believe where they feel safe is with the HR director. So it's very important that the HR director make it a safe haven, make it a place, not where someone comes to talk to you that you fix it for them, but that you empower them instead of disempower them, where they come to you and instead of listening to things, do not gossip. Do not take the safe information and then talk to those that don't need to know about it. It's very important, and it's kind of like being a coach at the heart, because I have to hold a lot of information that I cannot share with others. So I think it's almost like being a therapist, a coach. The HR director is the heart of the organization, and they have to take it seriously, because that's what makes the whole organization thrive.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm glad I asked you that question, because I think that's very important for everyone listening. I'm sure everyone's aware of that already, but it's good to hear someone like yourself say that. So how long has the book been out for?
It came out last May.
Fantastic. And I'd love to hear what's the feedback been so far for people that have implemented it. What are some of the things you're hearing from everyone? What's the impact that you had?
Well, it's become a national bestseller around the world. It's been translated into 5 languages, and it is doing very well. I have organizations that have turned it into a book club. And when they write to me, I'm like, please invite me, because so I can talk about the book.
Yeah.
So teachers are using it, salespeople are using it, HR directors are using it, leaders around the world. There's all kinds of associations when they get together. They always talk about, have you done the assessment? I know, because they call me and they go, oh, he turned out to be a fixer, So this is a book. It's not really, I know it's called it's a leadership book, but truly it's a life book. You can give it to any person, any age, in any industry, and it's a game changer.
Yeah, that's the impression I got as well. So tell us briefly about the assessment. What does that look like? Is that an online assessment? Is it something we take within the book? How does that work?
So it's online, and there was a mistake in the book. It gave the wrong URL. So my assistant gets inundated with 100 emails a day. And so what we've been doing actually is sending the right URL in order for individuals to take the assessment.
Well, fantastic. I'll copy that in the show notes for everyone, all of you listening. Don't worry, that'll be in the show notes. Whatever platform you're listening on, it will be in the show notes.
But they have to read the book in order to understand the assessment. Otherwise, the assessment doesn't.
Well, there's always going to be 2 links anyway, Lolly. So there'll be a link to the book and there'll be a link to the assessment. so you guys will have everything you need in the description as well. We'll make sure we get the link right and everything there for you as well. So that would be fantastic. Well, look, that leads us quite nicely on to the quick fire round, Lolly, where I'm going to ask you 5 questions. And you have no longer than 30 seconds to give us some amazing answers. Are you ready?
I am ready.
Well, I think I know the answer to the question, but I'm going to ask you anyway. What was the number one thing that was holding you back from becoming a leader within your industry?
Myself.
Yeah.
It's always you.
Yeah, right? I'm not surprised.
The universe out there there's so much opportunity. The only person that holds you back is you yourself.
Fantastic. What's the best piece of advice or business advice or advice you've ever received?
I really believe that most people, when I talk about finding greatness or embracing greatness, people always say to me, it's only for a selected few. It's for him, it's for her, it's not for me. And that's not true. Every single one of us has greatness within us. The only thing that we don't do is embrace it. So you have to learn how to embrace it.
Yeah, very briefly, that's something I've also experienced. Having such incredible guests like yourself and the other members on, I've always held them to such a high standard. And when I've had a conversation with them, I'm like, they're just like me. The only difference is they took that step. They put themselves out there. They were willing to challenge themselves. And that really opened up my eyes as well by having conversations with these I've had conversations with CEOs of, billion-dollar companies and realized they're not too far away from where I am. It's just the mindset that they've employed. Fantastic. Besides your own book, because I will certainly be linking that in the description for everyone, what's one book you'd recommend to our audience and why? Or more than one if there is. And I can see you've got a lot behind you. So
we've discussed books before we started talking. I read a book a day. And so there are many, many books that are very important to read. So I'll say a book, but then I'll also say a genre of a book. Is that okay?
Yeah, fantastic.
So I think it's very important that people read biographies. Why? Because exactly what you just said. When we hear about somebody who's done something wonderful in the world, we only hear about how great they were, but we don't hear the 365 days of how they suffered to embrace that greatness. And when you read a biography, you learn all about the suffering and the discipline and everything that happened in order to embrace that greatness. So I'm a big component. Since I read a book a day, every summer for the past almost 30 years, I always read biographies. I started with reading all the presidents, then I started reading with all innovators, then I started to read all about philosophers. Read about biographies. You learn so much about others and yourself. Number two is the book that I recommend that everybody should have at their nightstand, that I reread every single year, is The Man's Search for Meaning for Viktor Frankl. I think it gives you a foundation, and it changes the question about saying, what should I do in the world? And it changes the question, what does the world want from me? And that change of a question is a game changer for every individual.
Fantastic. And I completely agree with you on your first point, because that was the tipping point for me of deciding to actually leave my company and pursue, starting my own company, was by listening to I actually listened to audiobooks, but it was the same as biographies. And then I was like, wow, you don't hear about the 1,000 failures, you just hear the success. So you always see the successes of all these organizations and these individuals and these leaders. But when you take a look behind and you realize there was, thousands of failures before they achieved that, but that's just not what the focus is on. It's on the big, shiny success that they've had. And everyone goes through that. The multiple failed businesses, bankruptcy in some cases, and they still keep coming back. And then for me, that was a real eye-opener and made me take that leap.
There's a new book called Turbulent Times. It just came out. I read it within the first day that it came out. It takes 4 presidents and it talks about all the heartache that they've went through. We only know the greatness that they did.
Yeah.
And it compares them their hardships to each other. It's a brilliant book. I mean, I read it. I couldn't put it down. It's a great book.
What's it called?
Turbulent Times.
Fantastic. Well, again, I'll link that for you guys. So you can have a good look. Could you share one internet resource that you use to keep up to date with current events?
Oh, I read everything online about the news, because most people, first of all, in every industry that I coach, it affects the leaders. So I need to know what's happening in current events. So I am a news junkie, and most people say, don't listen to the news, it gets you depressed. And I'm
that guy, by the way. Unfortunately.
I want to be a witness to what is happening, so we can have a say about what we do. If we turn our back, then we're turning our back on not only on ourselves, but others. We are collective individuals, and we are responsible for each other. It's not about me, it's about we. It's not only in organizations, it's about the world. We have to start caring about each other, because the me in my book is the mercenary, and it's all about being selfish. We have to be the knight, the one that is loyal and cares about others. So I am a news junkie because I need to know what is happening so I can say, where can I have an input in the world?
What sites are you normally using to consume?
Everything from the New York Times. I read the New Yorker. I read everything.
Everything.
I'm a junkie.
I think we've established that by now. That's definitely a good thing to have. It's a good habit to have as well, and it's definitely reflected in your background, which is amazing, by the way, as well. What's one thing about your business that you're most excited about?
So interestingly enough, in my beginning of my business, when you first start out your business, it's all about, what am I going to be doing? What am I going to be doing, right? What is my next thing? How can I grow my business? And I've come to a new phase in my business where it's about, who am I being in my business? Before it was all about doing, and maybe it has to do with my age, because, my 20s, my 30s, my 40s, my 50s was about doing. And now it's about being. Maybe it's my second purpose. Maybe it's about saying, how am I leaving my mark with every single individual that I meet? Even with you, Chris, I want to know, did I bring some value to what we talked about today? So every moment now in my business is bigger than before. It was like, what can I accomplish? There's been a little game changer. So it's not one thing. It's more about who I am.
Fantastic. Well, look, Lolly, you're giving us some amazing advice and some amazing guidance. So I know our members will be, and our listeners will be a lot better off for it. So I really appreciate you taking the time out to join us. Before we wrap up, give our listeners, if there's one parting piece of guidance that you could give to our listeners, and also the best way that they can find out more about you and your work?
So I gave it away a little bit before, so I'm going to say it again, if that's okay with you, because I want to really stress greatness is not for that person out there. Greatness exists within you. Please, every single person know that and learn to embrace it. If you can't, then read The Leadership Gap. It'll give you ways of how to embrace your own greatness. And you can find me at lollydaskal.com and on social media. You found me on LinkedIn. Find me on LinkedIn and Twitter. I am accessible, available, and I would love to hear from each and every one of you. If anything resonated, please ping me, tweet me, send me a message.
Fantastic. Well, guys, you heard it. If you head over to hrleaders.com, there you'll find all of the show notes on the episode, everything we're talking about, link to the books, to the resources, to everything there will be there for you guys. Lolly, thank you again for taking the time to join us, and I wish you all the best until we next speak.
We're going to meet again because you are amazing. This was really fabulous. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lolly.